set?
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Is that okay?
Yeah, I don't want to, so that's perfect.
That'll work for it? All right. We go? All right, we still got some people coming in here, but let's get this thing kicked off. My name is Pat O'Brien. I am a first-year student here at MIT Sloan and a degenerate gambler, so I'm pretty excited. I'm pretty excited to be a part of this panel. We got a great crew for you today. I'm sure if you were here last year, if you've seen any of the videos from the past couple years, this usually is one of the best panels we get at the conference. So I'd like to introduce our panelists today. We got Jay Kornegay from the Las Vegas Hotel and Casino. We have Patrick Donovan from the sportsboss.com. Chad Millman, editor-in-chief, ESPN Magazine. David Frohart-Lane from the Three Red Group, the winner of the Las Vegas Hotel Super Contest this year. And Jeff Maha, who knows every single person at this conference, I've noticed in the past few hours. Today we will be going for about an hour, and if you have any questions, you can either text them to text them to the number 22333 and use the code word of betting. You can also tweet to @poll and still use that betting password before you send it in. So without further ado, I'm gonna kick things off and let Jeff take this away.
Sure. I'm so fascinated by these guys that I'm not even sure where to start. But I'll start with Patrick, who is the handicapper here. We kind of had an argument off back in the back room before we came on about whether he was a handicapper or a tout and what the difference is between the two of them and what that even means. So Patrick, I'll let you address that. First of all, like describe to us what a handicapper is, what you do, and then specifically take us through one of your plays today that we kind of talked about and how you came to that.
Okay. Yeah, I think there's a difference between touts and handicappers in the sense that a handicapper is more analytics driven, is more transparent in their activities, whereas a tout to me is more of a machine, a marketing machine. With little transparency, kind of using big words, game of the year, game of my life, game of my career, instead of using, static ratings on their plays and being transparent.
So quick question. If you're a handicapper, and you're a good handicapper, I assume, right? You think you're a good handicapper?
I think I'm all right.
Why don't you just bet your own games? Why would you sell your games to start with?
Well, I do bet my own games, but I don't see, there's really no, it doesn't impact me by selling my advice to somebody else if they can profit off of it. So I don't see any reason why not to. If I can consistently win and feel comfortable doing that philosophically.
So do you always bet your games first and then send your picks out?
Yeah, or vice versa. Either way.
Vice versa. Do your picks ever move lines?
No, I wouldn't say so.
Are you, Jay, are you aware of his work at all?
No.
Are there handicappers or touts who's let's just say touts, anyone that sells picks, are there any people that sell picks who move lines?
Not that I know of. I had the same question that you did, Jeff, and that is, why sell your picks? If you're that good, why would you have to sell your picks? I know some of the top handicappers that we have in Las Vegas don't sell their picks. They just go along and do their business, pretty much stay under the radar, and they're so good, they're very good, that there's no reason for them to sell their picks.
Now, we talked on Thursday night, you mentioned that your job is to kind of figure out what the sharps and the analytic people are doing and stay ahead of them. Can you describe kind of that process of how you figure that out? By the way, it kind of reeks to me because it's like what they used to do to us at the blackjack tables. They try to figure out what we did.
That's our job, Jeff. I mean,
but is it
we're
though?
trying to figure out what you're doing. We're trying to figure out how you're beating us.
But is that your job though? Shouldn't your job be to just be on the same side of them? Because like take the Super Bowl for example, right? You guys were on the same side as the sharps, and you made a ton of money off of it because all the public was on the other side.
In most cases, we do try to position ourselves with the better handicappers in Las Vegas. So when we know that they're on a particular game, whether they beat it at or bet it at our house or around the world, we're trying to identify those type of movements and those type of bets. But these, statistical systems, they're looking for deviations, they're looking for weak spots, market inefficiencies, and it's our job to sit there and try to identify them, and whether position ourselves to be on the same side as those type of plays, or correct weak spots that we might have in our own lines. So we do a little bit of both, but I can tell you that our main goal is to position ourselves in the best possible position, and usually that's with some of the top handicappers that are out there.
Can you just give a quick synopsis of the money flow, line movement in the Super Bowl, since that's a game that everyone obviously watched and understands?
Well, we have about 4 or 5 handicappers at the LVH Superbook, and we had a range from anywhere from 2.5, Seattle 2.5 to Seattle -1, and we ended up posting Seattle -2. At that time, it was one of the first lines out there in the world, and the money started pouring in on Denver, and it kind of snowballed as a lot of sharps out there wanted to jump on this movement and possibly get in early and then sell late. A lot of these guys that took the Broncos at, say, pick or +1 or even -1 was really hoping that this line would go all the way up to 3. And they were holding out until the last possible moment. And I know a couple of books were just on the verge, in Las Vegas anyway, going to 3, but it really didn't happen. I think one book did go to 3, but it was a case where that early movement that we saw, it was just a fine-tuning of the market. And for the most part, we were off. We underestimated the support that Denver was going to get. In the earlier 2 playoff games, the general public bet against the Broncos. They bet the Chargers against the Broncos, they bet the Patriots against the Broncos, and all of a sudden they get to the Super Bowl, everybody's on Denver. So we had to adjust accordingly.
Do you think, were they betting the Broncos at pick or at -1 or +1? I think you said +1, right? Were they betting the Broncos hoping to get to the Broncos -3? Was that the idea, or do you think they were actually seeing value in that particular number?
I think they were trying, and this happens, and it doesn't happen as often as it did in the past. You don't see numbers running so much that that they have these type of opportunities, but this number was definitely running, and some of the sharps out there were trying to bet Denver early at +1 pick, -1, hoping that they could get Seattle at +3 and have a nice little middle going into the game. But as we all know, it really didn't happen. The number didn't go to 3, so a lot of that late money that came in on Seattle had to get off their earlier bets at +2.5 and even at +2, as you saw some of the bigger markets in the world close at Denver -1, -1.5.
When you, David, as the resident expert here, David won 68% of his picks in the Las Vegas contest, which is very impressive. You want to briefly talk about the contest, and then also I'd love to see, did you use your model on the Super Bowl at all and look at what the pick would be?
Yeah, I mean, there's, I'll answer the second question first. I mean, I have a model, which is just a statistical model that churns out a result, but then I make tweaks to it. So, when I did this for the Super Bowl.
What are some of the inputs of the model?
I actually restrict it only to box score data, which I'll acknowledge is kind of limiting, but I just kind of make it a project to do the absolute best I can of extracting as much information as I can from that box score data, and then I have to make adjustments on my own because there's some
what are some specific? What are some specific things in the box
score? What box score are you talking about?
Injuries,
there's a lot of different.
Injuries are like team level statistics. So basically, what I'm saying is I don't have individual player.
Are you being cagey or are you being vague?
First downs, rushing yards, passing attempts, anything that's in the box score, points scored, points allowed, all that stuff. So, that thing spit out Denver -1, but then I just figured with all the injury problems of Denver's defense and everything, and then just the fact that Seattle had a good pass defense against Peyton Manning, I figured Seattle -1.5 was the right line. So, when Jay was saying that opened up Seattle -2, I was like, okay, no bet here, that's the perfect number. But then I was quite surprised. It steamed all the way to Denver -2.5.
Patrick, when you looked at that line, what did your numbers say?
Yeah, that's interesting because when I saw it came out, Seattle was favored. I actually sent out a tweet saying I had Denver. I was talking to David about this the other night. I had Denver as about a 2-point favorite in the game. So when it steamed up to Denver, I got concerned once I saw that, all that money coming on Denver, but that was about the number I had on it. I am a Broncos fan, but it was an unbiased power rating.
Jay, when you look at that game and that line and what happened, obviously you get influenced by it. What are the analytics that made Seattle really someone that you guys wanted to set as a favorite?
Well, just looking at some of the past performances and again, going back to some of the betting patterns we saw leading up to that game where people were betting against Denver, and Denver was a public team the entire season, and then we get to the playoffs and the public was betting against the Broncos, and it just kind of caught us a little off guard as those betting patterns changed. But the Super Bowl line is the one line that's really geared towards the public. And all the other lines that we make for the rest of the year is pretty much going against the sharps, the wise guys, the guys that are sophisticated, that have systems, programs. With the exception of the Super Bowl, all the lines are geared towards the wise guy play. The one game that's dominated by pure public money, and it overruns all the sharp money, is the Super Bowl. And that's one of the reasons why we thought that, let me go back to Seattle. Seattle was also a public team. They were really getting a lot of support throughout the entire season. The numbers, I'd say we're not defined like a lot of people think. We're not running all this massive data. We're not a bunch of mathematicians back there in the NFL. The NFL is more of an art form for us. Our power ratings are pretty much in our head. In fact, I think you guys would be very disappointed on how we make some of these lines. It's about four. That's it. I mean, for the NFL, and we usually at the LVH we usually post NFL lines about a week ahead of everybody else, and it's exactly that. We have some very sharp odds makers and guys that have been doing it for a long time, and it's pretty much a group just like this where we just kind of go around and say, what do you got? 2.5, 1.5, 2, 3. Let's go up with 2, unless someone makes a case.
Sounds pretty scientific. Yeah.
But it is a feel, and I'm going to tell you, odds making on our part is always going to have some kind of art form to it, and I think that's where you might see some of the flaws of just statistical systems. They don't have.
Well, so that's a good thing that I actually want to touch on. So like when we look at that Super Bowl line, right? My theory on that line and why it was kind of wrong or why it was misleading was a lot about the difference in competition that the two teams had faced, right? I mean, the Broncos hadn't faced a really top defense, all year. And this was, the top defenses all were in the NFC. So where are the failings of some of the statistical models that we see?
Well, I think I think it doesn't account a lot of the human factors, like whether it's travel, emotion. Some of the top handicappers that I talked to
But I mean, that's not like the Super Bowl wasn't won or lost because of travel or emotion, right?
Well, I mean, Seattle, big rivalry are the 49ers. I mean, that was a really big game for them. And there was...
But shouldn't they have been a letdown then for the Super Bowl?
A letdown for the Super Bowl?
That's what I'm saying. This is all like doesn't make any sense to me that we're talking about.
That's what some people were looking at.
Like, no matter how big of a deal the conference championship is, like you're going to get up for the Super Bowl.
Well, you get 2 weeks, but also what made the Super Bowl so difficult to handicap and to make a line for was the public perception. And the perception was that the 49ers were becoming better and better as a team, and that they were really a team that a lot of people were thinking was probably the Super Bowl favorite, the team to represent the NFC. So when the Seahawks beat them, and they didn't beat them soundly, they potentially beat them, or they did beat them because of what a lot of people saw as sort of a lucky play that where they had otherwise been dominated the rest of the game and possibly could have lost the game on a last-second touchdown. Then you've got the Patriots, who had been playing great, and then the Broncos beat the Patriots, and you've got this sort of vortex of all these public teams and people parsing the way each team won the game. So that's why, even though the right play was to open the Seahawks as 2-point favorites, you had all this public money rushing in. And don't forget, you're in Vegas for championship weekend, and that is as big a weekend in terms of handle as anything that is leading up to the Super Bowl now. And so you've got people rushing out of town who had just seen the Broncos destroy the Patriots, who everyone thought was playing as well as anybody could be playing because the week before, LeGarrette Blount had run for God knows how many yards. And you've got the Seahawks barely beating the 49ers and everyone thinking they barely escaped. So you've got this rush of money that comes in. That's what makes the Super Bowl so difficult. That's where the analytics on a game like that, from an odds-making perspective, go out the window. Now, it turns out everybody who was handicapping from an analytical perspective, most people were on the Seahawks. And so they were thrilled, because most people I spoke to were on the Seahawks and would have played the Seahawks at -2, except they got lucky and the public money moved the game towards the Broncos. And so that's why the Super Bowl always ends up being the most difficult game to calculate from an analytical perspective, because the public has so much influence on that particular line.
I think the Super Bowl really stands out. I mean, normally if you disagree with the market by 4 points, you're wrong, is basically what it comes down to. But I do feel like the Super Bowl is different. Like, you can actually look at that line and say that line was wrong by 4 or 5 points, and that's just, I attribute that to all the public money that comes in on the Super Bowl.
Patrick, why do you think that your model was off on the Super Bowl? Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe you don't think it was, but.
Right, yeah. Just because the outcome of one game was one way, it doesn't mean the model is off. But, you know, one of the interesting things about the Super Bowl is I tend to look at overall performance, but then I also look at home and road splits. And then I also break things down strength of schedule wise, where I break a team into rushing, passing, and miscellaneous categories, such as first downs, time of possession, things that you can't put into a rushing or passing category. And I break strength of schedule down into those buckets to see how a team is truly performing, because oftentimes we'll hear, you know, the media talk about they have the 10th ranked defense. Well, what's better, the 10th ranked defense facing the worst schedule of offenses in the NFL, or the 15th ranked defense facing the toughest schedule of offenses in the NFL? So you got to be able to quantify that. And also, one of my big things with Russell Wilson, I mean, his splits are poor on the road. He's a much better quarterback at home versus the road. And I kind of played that into everything. And I also figured the very vanilla defensive game plan that Seattle usually plays, I thought Peyton would be able to take advantage of that. But that's
what did you make the line in the national championship game, the college national championship game? What did your model come out at? Just so you guys know, Florida State was favored by about 8 to start, and then it went all the way up to, 11 at the end?
Yeah.
Roughly speaking.
I actually don't really have a power rating formula for college, for football now, because I think it's very complex with the strength of schedule. When I was sitting in on the college football panel yesterday, you know, they were discussing different ways to calculate a strength of schedule. How do you really calculate it? You know, how do you know if they say it's the 32nd toughest schedule? What is that based on? Teams' records? Well, who did they play? It's just too tough, I think, to come up with. But
the national championship to me was a complete example of strength of schedule difference, right? You had Florida State, who had played this ridiculous schedule and beat the crap out of everyone doing it, against Auburn, who'd played this horribly hard schedule and had barely survived.
Right.
And so the analytical systems, everyone that I looked at said that Florida State should have been favored by 15 or 16 in that game. We all kind of know what happened. I mean, they barely won. And I wonder, is there opportunities, because analytical systems that people use often have failings, to look for opportunities? Like, have Ken Palm and Sagarin and all these things, have they become too commonplace where now there's no information asymmetry? I know, Chad, you and I were talking about this a little bit.
I was going to say, who are you asking that to? But
any of you guys, we're all experts.
I feel like there's no information asymmetry, but it's interesting because all these things have democratized the process of betting. And they've also made it much more popular. And it's made it much more accessible for people to understand what's happening and feel comfortable doing it. I mean, there's a lot of other sort of forces in play here because the internet has made it so much more accessible, so you don't have to go to some dark alley and get kneecapped if you're going to make a bet. But you have opportunities to bet online, and you have just this rush of information coming from online, and then you get guys like Ken Pom and you get guys like Sagarin who are using quality analytics, or even, you know, the guys like Football Outsiders who are basing a lot of what they're doing on data, and data that is being used by professional teams to make the same decisions they make. And so that lends a lot more credibility to the decision making. I don't know that that there is a flood of the market that has devalued all this information. I just think maybe in that particular instance, the information they were using, I think the strength of schedule thing wasn't weighted highly enough. And that's why everybody was coming out with Florida State, you know, should win this game. I think, you know, we added in the same thing at ESPN.
You said on your podcast that they were going to kill him.
I think I did.
Yeah. No,
But
you definitely did.
I did that based on, you know, the information I was getting and the information I was looking at and the stats that I look at. I can be wrong.
When you obviously talk to a lot of sharps, is there one sharp, I asked you this offward, but if you could bet on only one guy's games, who would it be and why?
Somebody who doesn't go on his show, maybe?
Yeah, seriously. David Frohart Lane, definitely.
That's tough. It would have worked out well last year. I'm not sure I'm the guy next to.
Yeah.
Maybe the guy who was on this panel last year would have been a good bet.
You know, who's obviously brilliant on the NBA. You know, there's a group, you know, that Patrick and Jay know, Right Angle Sports. They do a lot of college football and a lot of college basketball. And I think a lot of the handicappers that become most successful are the ones who are finding the niche in particular sports. So some guys, they're betting only college basketball totals. And when they're betting totals, they're not paying attention to the big conferences. They're paying attention to the sort of the mid-majors and smaller. And that's where the value is. And that's all anybody in Vegas is trying to do is find the value.
What are some, okay, if we talk about these guys that are doing college basketball totals, what kind of analytics are they using?
You know, a lot of it is efficiency ratings, offensive efficiency, defensive efficiency, how teams are, three-point efficiency, things like that. Pace is a big deal. I mean, you mentioned Ken Pom. You know, I was at the LVH, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, and I was talking to a couple of Jay's guys, and we were behind the counter, and I just said, you know, who are people talking about? Who are the guys who are coming to the counter, the wise guys? Who are they betting? Who's betting? Who are they thinking about? What are they following? And to a man, everyone said they're following KenPom.com. Ken Pom now writes for Insider at ESPN, but he's a guy who was just doing a lot of what people are doing now or had been doing for baseball. He was looking at metrics in an entirely different way for college basketball. And it's fascinating because if you look at the stuff that he has, and now there's other people doing this as well, you know, Patrick has sort of worked up a formula that is also sort of dependent on advanced level stats, that you see a huge difference between what the public is thinking about teams and what guys who are paying attention to these the games at a much more advanced level are thinking about. And that's what wise guys do too. I talked to a wise guy a couple weeks ago. This was before Syracuse went on their mini streak right now that they're on, their losing streak. And he didn't even have Syracuse as a number 1 seed. And I'm like, Syracuse has been playing great. What's going on? He goes, you know, if I look at my numbers, they're just not that good. You know, there are days where I see Iowa being as a higher seed than Syracuse. And that's based on, you know, pacing and efficiency and things like that, where he just wasn't loving Syracuse. And it's, you know, soon after that, Syracuse started dumping games.
Jay, we talked about Chad wants to bet David's games all the time. So who do you fear the most as that walks into your sports book?
Well, I don't want to give out names.
Well, just describe them and describe what they do and their methods.
Yeah, well,
I'm sure these people don't even know their names anyways.
Yeah, there's some names out there that everybody knows, but these guys, these systems, these programs, one of the hot topics these days has been the number of possessions. A lot of people looking at that, and I think the difficult part for any of these systems, statistical systems, is trying to quantify value. I mean, how do you measure this? And I hear short sample, I hear small sample a lot, and people trying to use these type of systems to benefit and get, recognized deviations, however it might be, but how good or how long are these things going to last? And that's what I hear on the other side of the counter. And even though it's becoming more and more popular, and there are some...
so you're bearish on analytics for sports betting?
Yeah. On our side of the counter, Jeff, we really don't do that much. I mean, we're doing a little bit more and more each year. Right. We're trying to look at Ken Palm, like you said, that 4 or 5 years ago we looked at that. Whether it's other websites or systems, ratings that we use, we don't actually calculate those ourselves. We actually go to many different types of websites and use that information if we need to. If we are, I heard last year you guys talking about player profilings. We look at people that are beating us, and we're trying to figure out what they're doing, and whether we have to we look at their track record, look at their types of bets, the time that they bet these things. And we look at some of the information that's out there on these websites, whether it's Ken Palm, Massey, whatever it might be. I mean, we use ESPN. We look over all this type of information to try to figure out what kind of angle that they might be coming at us with. So,
do you think that if you're sort of bearish on analytics, then where do you think the value, or I'll ask this whole crew, where's the value come from in the future for sports betting? I mean,
I think the value is approaching the whole process completely differently. I think the analytics are getting better and better. The edges available are just smaller and smaller. There will always be edge. You'll always be able to figure out how to bet with positive expected value. But I think the edges you're chasing are just going to keep going down, and it's going to be to the point where it's not worth it. At the same time, you just have to stop looking at it as like, I'm going to find value in an NFL line. You start looking at new stuff like daily fantasy sports. I think the biggest opportunity in the world right now is in Europe, where they have these betting exchanges where you're just going to be, churning out volume constantly. It's kind of like, high frequency trading, where you're going to be betting the game like both ways, like 20 times, and just trying to make a tiny bit on each transaction. There's big money there, but I think it's going away, and because people are getting smarter.
I agree. I think the value in betting isn't in finding that unknowable stat. It's in the offerings. It's what is the next thing in-game wagering. The first 5 innings of betting on baseball. What are those things where the market hasn't quite caught up to what the professionals are doing yet? Is where professionals are finding the most advantage. Because I've spoken to so many professional gamblers who they're doing as much playing in-game as they are doing pre-game. Because...
Are they able to get large amount of money down on in-game and first 5?
Some guys are. I mean, it depends on what how many bets you're laying. But the way these things are sliced, you've got all this data you are thinking about, and you've got all this research you've done as a professional gambler over the course of a week or over the course of a season. And the way NFL lines specifically come out, it's so difficult because they're moving so quickly, and they become pretty sharp, pretty quickly. And so your opportunity to really beat the market is when the game is happening, because you've got a better sense of how these teams play. You are going through the box scores on a week-to-week basis. You are understanding the pace and rhythm of a game. And so when you are betting in the game, you're basing it on the data that you have available, but also sort of this innate knowledge that you have from having watched these games over the course of several weeks. That's why a lot of guys don't really start betting significantly until they're 3 or 4 weeks into an NFL season.
I think a big part too is for those looking to bet sports and maybe looking for opportunities would be rule changes in style of play, that where these, someone comes up and has this data that, that might find deviations in the market. And I think that whenever there are rule changes in any sport.
So give me an example of a rule change that influenced things.
Well, at first, when the season, when the college basketball rule change about checking, and we thought that the scoring was going to go up. It did actually at the beginning of the year for a while, but then the market slowly caught up to that. And I believe I mentioned to you just about a month ago, I think we were looking at 54% of college basketball games have actually gone under the total. But maybe you were able to capture that at the beginning of the year as most of those totals were going over, and there was more scoring, but then it panned out. It ran its course, and you're going to have to look at the next opportunity. But that's just a small example of many different rule changes that people can take advantage of if they have the right data.
Patrick, have you looked at any of that type of stuff, like last year or 2 years ago when the NBA had their lockout and scoring was way down? Like, how do you take into account things like that, or can you give me an example of a place where you've been able to exploit that?
Well, kind of just going back to the question that you just previously asked first, I think there are numerous areas where you can find value, and it's not necessarily mathematically based, but it's been a common theme I've heard about in other conferences here, is the psychological, emotional level that teams are going to play with. So it matters what sport we're talking, because in a football season, there's only 16 games in professional. So you kind of know that everyone's going to bring it for the most part each game. But where you can really find edges are in college basketball, NBA, where there's longer seasons, and it's a little easier to tell, who needs the game more. Or I also look at the probability. So if a team wins like 10 in a row, and especially if some of them were, close games down to the last second recently, then I like to, fade that team. So I've been fading Florida a lot of late. They just keep barely scraping by in these low-scoring games. They're very close, and they haven't been covering a lot lately. Virginia, which we talked about in the green room today my biggest play is on Syracuse, because Virginia has won about 11 games in a row. They're statistically, defensively they play well, but offensively they struggle. So I think those are the areas you have to try to find an edge, whether it's probability, the likelihood of something happening, and the emotional level that a team is going to play with, like we saw NC State against North Carolina earlier this week. NC State needed that game to stay in the bubble conversation. North Carolina had won like 10 in a row. Perfect spot to take the Wolfpack. They almost won, but they covered.
I completely agree with him. There's sort of we just did the analytics issue that's out now, and a lot of the theme of the analytics issue was the study of dark matter in analytics, right? How do you measure chemistry? How do you measure momentum? How do you measure these things that are now the intangibles? Since there has been such a huge statistical revolution in sports, what is the next phase of that? And certainly from a broader study perspective, those intangibles, I think, are what people are going to try to put their finger on, at least, from a team level, but also from a gambling level. The difference is that from a gambling level, it's something that they've been talking about since the point spread was invented. Is how much does this team need this game? What is the emotional factor? They've been inherently making that a part of their power rating since the beginning of betting on sides.
I still think there is some analytical information that's not probably fully integrated into the betting market. I think if somebody could do a really thorough job of processing like pitch FX data and detecting when a pitcher is getting better or worse or learning a new pitch, like that could be an edge. So I still think there's some to be done on the analytical side, but again, the edges are going to be smaller and smaller.
When you guys think about something like injuries, how do injuries or the concern that I have in this conversation is that we're talking about all these things, right, that are obviously factors in the success of a team, but are really hard to quantify. So they don't sound very analytical to me. I mean, Patrick, your explanation about Florida and whatnot, I understand it, but it also doesn't give me a warm sense of calm that you know what you're doing. When, you know, what is the sort of like, how do you actually create analytics around something like that?
Well, that's the tough part. I was discussing this with Chad in the walk over. It's tough to kind of find a way to put a numerical value on things like an emotional level or the probability that something's going to happen. It's hard to find a numerical way to adjust your power ratings and the spread to evaluate that. But to your point on injuries, I think injuries are one of the most overrated things that handicappers or odds makers adjust for around, especially when you look at the.
But doesn't that mean then there's an opportunity?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I couldn't disagree with him more on that, by the way. So ask me about it after.
Well, why don't you guys talk to each other? You don't need to look at me.
So we can look at a couple of examples here. We can look at Miami, the Heat, right? LeBron James has missed, I don't know if it's like 7 or 8 games over the last however many years. They're 7-1 in those games. You look at that infamous Spurs-Heat game from a couple years ago where Popovich sent everybody back. Spurs win in Miami.
This is not a very big sample size you're talking here.
No, but I've actually researched this, where I was discussing with one of the students earlier, where I went back and I looked in the NBA at all-star players, and I looked at when they wind up missing 1 or 2 games, and the winning percentage ATS, where the team
that means against the spread.
Yes, against the spread. For
you
the
really
team that
think
was
anyone in this group doesn't understand that?
ATS?
It's like the smartest degenerates in the history of mankind.
You don't look like degenerates to me.
But in the NBA, when you're missing an all-star player for just 1 or 2 games, the rest of the players are able to elevate their game in that small sample size to actually cover, and the number was like 65%. I went back like 10 years. But most of the betting public will go the other way. Oh, LeBron James isn't playing. There'll be a huge adjustment, and
so then do you blindly bet on teams pretty much that are missing an all-star?
You honestly could blindly bet on teams that are missing an all-star in the NBA, and you would be profitable. You could blindly bet it. Just follow it out there.
So
see
to
what
me,
Not anymore, because now it's out
Oh,
there.
only in the first 2 games too.
It's only like
to me, this is one of those opportunity spots, right? Because I do think that the examination of the value of player injuries, I'm thinking more about the NFL than I am about the NBA. But
are you going to tout your Millman rankings right now?
I wasn't going to, but
Go
thanks for bringing
for it.
it up.
Go ahead and talk about it.
So for the past couple of years, we've done this thing on the blog that I do called the Millman rankings, because I'm a very humble guy. But it's based on a metric we created called point spread value above replacement. And what it does is it measures the value of a player against the point spread compared to what the spread would be if his replacement was playing. And it's got a bunch of complicated stats in there because,
what are they?
We're very, very smart.
What are the complicated
It's really,
stats?
they're not complicated stats, but what we're doing is we're going back and judging how teams performed without those players, what the stats of those players who replaced them were, and then just sort of doing formulaic complications.
Well, how can you do that with like a guy like Tom Brady, right? He hasn't missed
Well, then it's sort of a judgment call. You're basing.
So there's not a lot of analytics that go in it. It's kind of very subjective.
Here's what
Jeff,
you
pull
could
back
do.
the curtain on this thing, okay?
I don't know if this is what Chad's doing, but you could look over historically of all kinds of quarterbacks and see how much does a drop off from various levels of quarterback, how much does that hurt the team? And then you ask yourself, okay, where does Tom Brady fall on this spectrum of quarterbacks?
You need to
and
hire
try to go
him.
there.
The point is that you get a specific number on this, and if you are aware that there is an injury happening, if you're aware that the injury has happened, you can take advantage of that before the market adjusts and get a very good sense of what the value is in the point spread. If bookmakers have adjusted it too much, have they not adjusted it enough? And I think that's often why, I talk to so many professional gamblers who are watching preseason games deep into the fourth quarter because they want to know how good is the second or third string guard for the Niners in case the first string guard gets injured? Because that's a lot of the places where you're going to find value, is if that guy is out, and bookmakers don't necessarily adjust because, you know, the first string guard for the San Francisco 49ers isn't playing.
Well, let me give you an example, too. And a footnote in my comment, I definitely agree that if quarterbacks get hurt, especially the elite ones, clearly an adjustment needs to be made. But I'll give you an example.
I mean, do you think that an over-adjustment is made? Because that's the premise. The premise is not that this team is better without this player. The point is that the bookmakers over-adjust for that person being out, and therefore there's an opportunity.
I would say there's an under-adjustment for the elite quarterbacks in the NFL. I don't think, like, when Rodgers was out, I think they were adjusting it about a touchdown, 8 points. I don't think that's enough. I think it has to be higher.
Well, when Rodgers went out, they initially adjusted it a touchdown, but it closed at about 10 points.
Yeah.
And what was your Millman ranking on Rodgers?
He was at 10.
Oh.
But just
You like how I set you up there,
As
huh?
a matter of fact.
Jay, what's your take on the injury stuff and how you guys look to adjust things for injuries?
We're always concerned about injuries because of the timing of the injuries and when information might be out there. I know that there's been a lot of talk about some of the best handicappers out there have people at these games actually and find out that this guy is either going to play or not going to play. You know, maybe he's warming up and yeah, he's going to play, but he's looking like he's about 80%. So we look for those type of patterns before, maybe warm-ups or, late, let's say, late betting before a game tips or starts. Those type of bets usually seem pretty strong because when we have a guy that's questionable, it's like our biggest nightmare is, we prefer he's either going to play or he's out. When we see the word questionable, it's always a reason for concern. And then especially if we see some bigger plays come in right before the start of the game, either way, obviously if they're playing for a team that had a guy that was questionable, most likely it looks like he's going to go. Okay.
I remember the big headache, no pun intended, was the Steve Francis migraines like 15 years ago when I think he was playing for, it was either the Magic or the Rockets, but it was like 3 straight months he had these migraines that kept coming and going, and the line kept moving like 3 points each way, and there was, I guess, value to be had in just figuring out what the heck was going on with this one guy.
That's what gamblers remember, by the way. Remember that time Steve Francis had those migraines?
Yeah.
Steve Francis?
I just remember on the online forums a lot of bookmakers just venting and swearing. Like,
Do
why
you,
can't this guy decide?
Jay, do you agree with Patrick in that you overreact to injuries and there's an opportunity there?
Sometimes we overreact. Sometimes we don't react at all. We get paid for being close. That's our job. We have that luxury of just being close. When we have guys out there, and you guys have already shown this, there's difference of opinions out there. There's statistical systems that find value at -3.5, and there's others that find value at +3.5. And that's the beauty of being on the bookmaker side.
As time has progressed for you in your career, do you find that now you are closer to even on games, or are you more leveraged in games?
Even as?
Like even action versus uneven action. Has there been any trend in that? Because theoretically, if what you guys are saying and the edge is disappearing, then action should become more even, right? Is that true?
Well, they may like to have a side. I mean, they may like to, shade it more and more towards the sharp side, but maybe not completely matching it.
Right, but
I don't know what Jay's opinion is on this, but I've spoken to plenty of bookmakers who are comfortable basically betting on a side. They're not always looking for two-way action.
Has there been any trend is the question. Is there any, or is it the same as it's always been?
It's the same as it's always been, but these are small samples here. We're not concerned about a game. We're really not concerned about a week. If we start losing, for a month or something like that, then there's reason to have some concern, and we probably have to dig a little deeper what's going on there. Whether it's college basketball totals, first half numbers, whatever it might be. We're always going to analyze and look at those types of betting patterns that we're losing on and who we're losing to, and make adjustments from that point.
So let's go quickly down the line. I want to talk about specific statistics that you think are probably the most underrated statistics. So if there's one statistic in one sport that is really underrated that you would use to handicap a game, what would it be?
For me, I don't think there's anything simple out there. I think it's the complex stuff, like looking into the plus-minus numbers, not just using them blindly, but seeing how you can use them in a predictive way, looking
Plus,
at the
minus
pitches for basketball or hockey, but not just literally using them, like using them to try to,
Are you talking about individual people's plus minuses to understand their impact on the game?
To understand their impact on a game.
Got it.
For pitchers, pitch FX, I don't think the simple stuff's out there really anymore.
What do you think?
I mean, this isn't like the key to the kingdom, but yards per play in the NFL, I think, is a much truer indicator of performance and value than total yards.
It's a much better predictor, but I think it's in there. I mean, I don't think.
You think that's in the line already?
Yeah.
How about you, Patrick?
Yeah, for me, for my the statistical testing I do, it's no question net yards per pass attempt in the NFL. Nothing else.
You can explain that one. I find that interesting. So go ahead and explain why you think that is.
Well, it has the highest correlation with winning games, scoring points, allowing points. There's very few times over the course of a season where a team will lose the yards per pass attempt and lose the game. Very few.
Jay, do you have a favorite stat that you think is?
Like I mentioned earlier, I think the number of possessions is really hot right now, and
that's for betting totals?
Yes, yeah. We've always struggled with totals ever since I've been in the business, and it certainly is a battle. I think like in the college ranks with so many different styles and type of play and tempo and coaching changes, styles. There's so much information out there that the bookmakers have a very difficult time keeping up with that. So I think if I was to be on the other side of the counter, and I'm a bookmaker, not a handicapper, but if I was a handicapper, I'd probably be looking at totals because I think there's opportunities there.
What do you guys think is the most overrated stat? Don't say points. Or yards?
Yards per play? Just kidding, man. No, I don't know. I mean, it's most of the. I don't know. I'd say something like RBIs or whatever, but I think most people are past that at this point, or pitcher won-loss records. But I don't think those are really incorporated into the lines. I don't know. It's. I guess I just. Have the standard stat nerd line. I think most of the sabermetric stuff, the further deeper you go into that, is more predictive, and the traditional stuff is less predictive.
You guys have any, the overrated stats are, when I think about it, right, it's like in football, I mean, obviously, we talk about turnovers and things like that, creating opportunity. Win-loss record in baseball is really overrated, right?
I think you could probably say across sports, win-loss records are pretty overrated. I mean, a lot of times when I was, betting baseball, I was almost just even unaware of what teams' win-loss records were because it just doesn't impact the probability of them winning. Going player by player and having a projection for each player, like what's his probability, a double, single, et cetera, and just, playing a simulation and getting the probability that way.
Okay, let's talk about refs. What kind of, Patrick, you obviously get paid to do this. What kind of, do you have any, umpires, refs, anything like that? Does that figure into your model?
No, I don't really worry about that because I figure over the course of a season, everything's going to really even out for the most part. So while it might hurt one night, it's going to help another night, and it's going to all, come out even. But I will say, if you're a totals player, I don't play any totals, only sides. I think referees can be pretty good indicators.
Chad, from the sharps that you talk to, what kind of stuff are they doing with refs?
Not much. If we're talking about NFL, not much at all.
Let's talk about, the two places that I think that it's umpires in baseball is huge.
Was an under.
It's huge.
I mean, that was a real trend.
And in basketball, tendencies around fouls and possessions can have a huge impact.
I think it's more relevant in the NBA.
I think you need some new sharps.
It could be. It's true. Maybe they weren't ever that sharp to begin with.
I think that's true. I think that's true with umpires. It may be less true because people are like, we have pitch effects. We're able to evaluate the umpires. But when I was betting baseball, when people found out Hirschback was behind the plate, the line goes way down. You just wanted to bet that blindly if it wasn't baked in yet.
Jay, are you guys knowledgeable of the umpires?
We are, but I think the market's already caught up to that and adjusted to that. I think that was something that some people were taking advantage of years ago, but most of the bookmakers out there that set these lines have caught up to that and have that information handy when they're posting, especially baseball lines.
Actually, I'll take back some of my answer. I bet there is one thing that's an inefficiency in the market right now. Usually if you look at the cutting edge of sabermetric research, usually it takes a couple years for it to get baked into the lines. And a lot of this stuff about catcher framing, I think sabermetrics is just recently starting to appreciate that. I bet that'll be in the market completely in maybe 2 or 3 years, but there might be a little opportunity right now betting like the under on a catcher who's good at framing and getting strike calls.
Why have you never thought about being a professional sports gambler, or have you?
I did, and then I decided to be a trader instead, and I had really mixed feelings about that, and I had a lot of regret. And then all of a sudden, it became a lot tougher legally to do the gambling. So I was like, okay, there goes my regret. I'm just, it's okay. I can move on now. So.
Okay. Let's see. In terms of like major advances in sports or changes in sports, we talked a little bit about like what are some other things, Chad, that you see in the future where value might come, and what are the opportunities there? We'll get back to you.
Well, I was going to say, does it have to be a particular sport or any sport?
Any sport.
I think a lot about the NFL. And to me,
the NFL seems like the worst place.
It's the worst place to bet, but it's what everyone bets. And so
right,
that's
but why would that be the place where there's an opportunity?
Well, can I finish?
Might be where all the public is. I don't know.
I think there's constantly opportunities in offensive innovation because they are constantly changing the rules to benefit the offense. And so the person who is able to identify what the impact of that rule change is, and how that's impacting all the other stats across the board offensively, and then how those aren't yet baked into the point spread, is the person who's going to have the first mover advantage in those things.
Right. That's where like the statistical testing and kind of understanding your data and the evolution of the game. The game has changed. Back 20 years ago, it was critical to run the ball effectively and stop the run. But with all the run changes now, if you run statistical testing on the NFL data, it clearly shows passing is much more important than running the ball.
Jay, when a sharp is winning at a high rate, how big do his bets need to be for the casinos to start tracking him and figure out his system? Like, what are the size bets where you start thinking about someone?
Well, it does vary, but most of the sharps out there are going to bet your limits, whatever they might be, and whether they're 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, 10,000. Some of our house players are going to get a lot more than that. But
how much would you let David bet next year if he came in?
I like David. And I would let him bet. What do you think, David? 20, 30, 50?
Sounds good, yeah.
Keep up 68%, then I might be lower to 5. Maybe 2. But no, we get new players that come in all the time. Hosts will bring in players, and we have no idea what this guy's going to do. And it's one of the more difficult things that we have to deal with is player profiling from the very start, when we have no record, no history on this guy, and we're trying to figure out what type of player he is. Normally, after he makes about 2 or 3 wagers, we know what type of player he's going to.
I'm guessing you'd be more scared of a guy who comes in, not necessarily wins 5 games in a row, but has 5 games in a row where his play is like correlated to the line move. If the guy's like beating the line move each time, then like that's an indication he's pretty sharp, even if he goes 2 and 3 on those games or something like that.
Right, and that's why when we have 2 or 3 plays from a particular player or a new guy, that's something that we're going to look at. Is that did the lines or the games that he bet, did the lines move in his favor? Mm-hmm. He laid 2 and it closed at 4. That's a big red flag for us. For us, limits do vary. But guys that can come in and bet 10 or 20 a game, after 2 or 3 plays, we might raise those limits to 50 or something like that. But if the guy plays games that the line moved in his favor, like David said, there's a good chance that we would limit him to our normal limits for NFL would be $10,000.
How much are you letting Floyd Mayweather bet right now?
Floyd, he doesn't want to bet at our place. Yeah, limits are basically set by upper management and how much they can stomach. And it's certainly been well publicized that he bet six figures, and most books won't take that. Most books don't want to gamble with those type of wagers. And even though we think he's probably going to hit about 50%, most casinos don't want to stomach a $300,000 decision on any game. So most places won't give Mayweather those type of limits.
What advice do you guys have for a financial, statistical background person to get into the world of sports betting?
Throw yourself into something where you're going to get a lot of feedback quickly. So if you're trying to model a sport, quit worrying, don't worry about like accumulating hundreds of games to figure out whether you're good enough. Figure out whether your plays are correlating with the future line movements. And if they are, you're doing something right. And then you're on the right track. And just keep throwing yourself into situations where you're going to get that feedback constantly.
Chad or Patrick, you guys got any thoughts?
I would say don't do it.
Why?
Oh, because I just think it's a harder way to make a living because there's fewer places you can actually make a living doing it.
But doesn't that change if it becomes legal?
Well, yeah.
Or if you move to Europe.
You can move to Europe.
It's tough from the U.S.
Yeah, but who knows if it's going to become legal?
Well, what do you think? Is it going to become legal?
I think it's completely unknowable. I think anyone who says
Way to take a stand.
Well, you know what? It's just like, who knows what the Supreme Court is going to, if they're going to take a case. You know what I mean? It's just not anyone who says they can handicap whether or not the Supreme Court is going to take on a sports betting case is lying because there's no way to know it. Now, you could say, all right, let's think about this, because I was just having this conversation with a bunch of guys earlier. The Supreme Court likes to wade into high-profile decisions, so yeah, so this is a case they would be interested in. The lawyers that have been hired by both sides of the case are former Solicitor Generals to the United States. They might not have taken these cases if they didn't think they were going to get to the Supreme Court. The people who hired them might not have hired them if they didn't think these cases were going to get to the Supreme Court. So all of a sudden, you're narrowing the odds. So, I think someone told me earlier today that the odds of a case getting before the Supreme Court are 100 to 1. So if you incorporate those three factors, now you've shrunk the odds considerably, but it's still, 9 people who, I don't know any of them, so I have no idea what their mindset is. I'm basing it all on sort of the publicly available data. Would I like them to? Sure, but
if it became legal in the U.S. to bet in any state, what do you think would change in terms of the ability for people to beat the lines? Would anything change?
Oh, that's interesting. You know what?
Yeah, you guys are welcome to weigh in on this too.
There's so much money in the market already. It's not like people aren't betting, and so. It's funny to hear.
Yeah, but it's different. Like when you go to Europe or something, you can walk into a bar and make a bet.
Right.
There's a different accessibility. You don't think that people would change?
It's a completely different accessibility, but I do think, it's funny when you hear arguments about why there shouldn't be sports betting is because it will be something that has potentially more nefarious ends. And
well, let's not. The debate about whether it should be legal, I think everyone in this room would probably say it should be legal.
There's a larger point in that you think but it discounts the fact that people are already betting obscene amounts of money, billions of dollars. And so does that money that is in the market, does it increase 10%, or is it all those people are now just doing it legally? I don't know.
Jay or Patrick, do you guys have an opinion on this? The question is essentially, if gambling becomes legal in the U.S., will the lines kind of fundamentally change, and will there be any difference in that?
Well, I think one of the biggest problems to bet sports for a living is getting money down. And if you had more avenues to do that, I think it would lead to opportunity for more people to have success betting sports.
I mean, I think you guys are crazy if you don't think it would change. Like, cause
I think it depends on the nature of what becomes legal. Like if it's like completely unrestricted and you have these exchanges like in Europe, you're going to have people competing to basically be the bookie. You know, spreads are going to really narrow, and the market's going to become very efficient, but there's still going to be money to be made trading. If it's like a different situation where it's like regulated and there's specific bookmakers that are allowed to deal the games, it actually might not change that much. So
Well,
it depends on what's legal.
you know, my theory that I'm thinking about is just the way that you guys are talking about the Super Bowl and how the Super Bowl is so different, right? Because there's all these random people betting on it. And so now you had this opportunity in the Super Bowl where you guys could be highly leveraged, but feel comfortable because you had sort of this right position. Does that happen when gambling becomes legal in the US and all of a sudden now you have more schmoes gambling?
You have more schmoes, but the sharps would just do whatever they could to figure out ways and set up networks to just get more money down on the games. And so I agree. It might,
So you're saying there wouldn't
be
be a very fundamental change in the amount and the percentages?
I think there would be a small shift. I think it would become maybe a little bit easier because you're getting more public money, but I don't think it's going to be a huge deal because the sharps would be, there's people who would love to, I'm sure Billy Walters would love to bet more than he currently does on a game. And if it's legal across the country, like he'll probably figure out a way to do that.
Jay, can Billy Walters bet more on a game than he's already betting?
Sure. If it opens up, sure. If there's different operators out there, he's going to be able to get more money down. And like I said, that's one of the biggest problems for some of these guys that have great systems. One of the biggest problems is getting enough money down to make a living. And if you were to open it up across the country, which I'm all for, by the way, it's going to be easier for them, I think, to get more money down.
What would your guess be on how much Billy Walters puts down on a game? The most that he ever gets down?
I have no idea. I'm sure it varies, but he bets everywhere. So it's really, he's such an interesting character. He's as long as he's been betting in the industry, we don't really know that much about him, and except that he's very good, and he certainly can get a lot of money down. But to put a number on that, I have no clue.
Okay. Well, I think that's all the time we have. Thank you, guys. Thank you, panelists.